everyone. I'm Sade,
And I'm Renee.
and we're going to do a workshop today on redefining self-care. So we're going to start off with self-care practices. What is self-care and what that means to the general public. Redefining and deepening what self-care can mean in terms of unpacking trauma, what trauma is and triggers. We're going to wrap up with aftercare, and then we're going to conclude. So we'll start off kind of introducing ourselves and where we are with self-care and our relationships with ourselves right now. So I'm Sade, and right now my relationship with myself is better than it has been earlier in the winter, but still kind of an up and down process. I guess I'm feeling a little bit frustrated sometimes with how it's not as I felt like it was getting really positive for a while, and then it kind of was up and down.
For sure.
But I'm trying to, accept that that's just, life. That is just part of this healing process, is recognizing that it's not always going to be linear, and it's not always going to be an upward climb to this ideal, perfect relationship with myself.
Yeah, that hit perfect. Right. So my name is Renee, and my current relationship with myself is the best it's been ever, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. It's a work in progress, and sometimes I have good moments and I have not so good moments. I'm learning to go with the flow, ride the waves as well, being honest with myself and tapping into my own truth and not the truths that people have put onto me. Right, so I think that's where I'm at.
That's real. That's real. Thanks. So we kind of went into a relationship with self because that's a big part of self-care that isn't often talked about. How developing a not necessarily an always positive relationship with yourself, but a healthy and knowledgeable relationship with yourself is a big part of self-care. But how that process is not easy. It's not always fun, I guess, in the way that sometimes self-care is depicted on social media or in commercials, where it's kind of a lot of immediate gratification of things that are fun, like taking a bath or taking a nap, which are all important parts of self-care, but don't go into the deeper, more difficult parts of developing a good relationship with yourself, that a relationship where you can take care of yourself, in a true, deeper way. So we're going to just kind of go into what people's idea of self-care is. We did this exercise in sessions before, so we're going to kind of write some ideas that we thought of, or that came up in session, in terms of what words come to mind when you think of self-care. So I'm actually going to move my chair and just start writing down some of the thoughts that we had. So what is self-care? I'm blocking it. I'll have to write a little bit bigger. That's okay. So one that I remember that stood out to me a lot is the idea of adornment. So people brought up the idea that taking care of their hair, makeup, style choices, things like that for them really helped with their self-care practice, and overall was a big part of self-care for them. I don't know if you had any
Self-care. One that you already mentioned, sleep.
Sleep,
yeah. Sleeping, resting, relaxing. The idea of relaxing is something that's very new to me still. I don't really know how to relax. I'm I'm sitting down, but am I relaxed? I'm still overthinking. I should be doing something.
Right.
I should be productive. I shouldn't be watching Netflix right now.
So you can't even enjoy the rest because you're kind of almost still in that space of guilt, or that I shouldn't be doing this.
For sure.
Yes.
Definitely guilt. Definitely. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I need to be doing things busy. Especially as an entrepreneur, it's okay, you should always be productive. Who sleeps anymore? Business people don't sleep.
I don't sleep.
But I love sleep. I totally need sleep. My health has shown me over the years that I need it more than I think I thought I needed. So yeah, sleep is very important. Yeah, that's how I would write it too.
I want to circle it. It's important.
Yeah, I would underline it as well. Sleep is probably the most important thing. Sleep and water. Self-care is water.
Never doubt water. I always forget about water. I forgot how to spell it. That's how much I don't really interact with it.
Water is like, I think I had a, for sure, had a negative idea of water, especially when I was dealing with depression more on a regular basis, when it was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't feel like I could escape from depression at any moment. And every other post was, if you drink water, you'll be fine. Water is the cure. It's the healer of all things. And I was like, this is some, beep. But now water is such a big part of my life. I'm like, yeah, I drink like 2 to 3 liters of water a day.
Wow.
What?
Which is really, I guess, like the ideal. It does
Which
really
is
help.
crazy to think about, because I was like, before I had 1 glass of water, I'm like, I think I'm hydrated, And now I'm like, wow, I haven't had my 1 liter and it's 12. How will I manage?
I'm parched.
Yeah, that's it. So it didn't cure my depression, but it definitely kept me hydrated and allowed my organs to do things that it needed to do instead of always being on constant strain.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is hard to think about. I think what you brought up both with sleep and water is that, like, if you're kind of operating at a place where you're just kind of straining to get by, like you don't have enough rest, you don't have enough water. And I guess you also brought up an idea of, we're kind of often told that, like, we don't sleep. Like, it's like we have to keep going, like always be working. Don't take time for yourself. And that kind of applies to water too, where it's like, don't take time to like think about even having a liter of water or a glass of water. Yeah. Then it's really difficult to have a good baseline self-care because your body doesn't really even have what it needs.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then what you mentioned was like this linear process of like self-care, right? Even with like, I'm going to focus on water. There's going to be days where I have 1 glass and that is enough. Like that's, right. And not to beat myself up about it. I even have a water app that reminds me, have you had water right now? Like, have you had water this morning? Because it's like a gentle reminder. I don't think that there's much space for us to be gentle with ourselves in self-care and healing. There's a lot of growing pains that happen. And in that moment of growing pains, we have to acknowledge that it's going to hurt. And we're learning something. We're like training our brains to, love ourselves more or love ourselves in the way that we need. So yeah, it's just like, it's not like this always. Sometimes it's more like this and sometimes it's like, like that. And that is okay. So that's water.
I guess even something like the app, which I think maybe I'll make that the 4th thing. I don't think I'm going to have to do too many more, but I'll round off this little circle with, I guess, gentle reminders to do small, I don't want to say, I guess small basic things our body needs. Mm-hmm. We need. Like water and like rest. And I think that like when you were talking about how sometimes like it's made to seem like water, even sleep, sometimes when you look at self-care, like I was saying, like online or when it's marketed, it's kind of like just drink water and it's gonna like fix everything. And it's it's more complex than that in that like we were just talking about, it's important to like try to drink water, but especially when you're in really low depressive states, you don't have the energy to just drink a liter of water and like go outside and run and then like take a 5-minute power nap and then like all of this stuff. But even though we know it's important, it can almost feel overwhelming when it's marketed to us as like, this is the only way to take care of yourself and you have to do it in these specific ways, almost like it becomes another small task, which is hard when you're depressed. Yes. So I think that the app is a really good idea, like creating small gentle reminders, especially when we're in those spaces, to do that, but also being okay when it's like, maybe I didn't drink as much water today, maybe I didn't get, like I didn't rest that much, or the rest that I had was like a lot of like guilty thoughts, and not beating ourselves up that it's not perfect right away. Yes. But also like kind of reminding ourselves to have those basic things.
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Totally.
I should actually have some water after this. That's just a reminder to myself.
Me too.
You're sponsored by water.
That's it.
Okay. Just gotta get my slide back up. Give me 1 sec. There we go. Okay, so we were just kind of going over that because we wanted to get a sense of what people's thoughts of self-care was kind of going in before thinking about deepening it. And a lot of it was, like kind of things like drinking water, taking care of yourself. We also in session talked about things like bath bombs, like things that you can purchase to create self-care for yourself, which is also fine, but is often made to seem like that's like one of the only ways to do self-care, or like just kind of one of the ones that are focused on the most. So what are some of your self-care practices that you do day-to-day life?
Self-care. Drinking water, sleeping, resting, like taking a nap when I need to take a nap, and knowing that my naps cannot be like 20 minutes. My naps are like an hour and a half. And giving time and space for that, and not setting an alarm, that's self-care to me. And I know that some people don't have that option. But yeah, for me, when I wake up to the sound of an alarm, it makes me really anxious.
Right.
So self-care, what else is self-care? Wearing clothes how I want to wear it. Like if I want to, wear as little clothes as possible and it's -20, whatever, that's what's happening. And that's just where I'm at. But yeah, with like self-care practices, I try to understand that they have to factor me in, like the me that I am in the moment. If that means I'm having a bad pain day, self-care looks different. If I'm in a relationship, self-care looks different. If I'm single, self-care looks different. It's very flexible. It changes with my moods, with what my body allows and enables. What else? Sometimes with self-care, my self-care is more short-term. Sometimes it's longer-term things that I'm doing as well. I think that is where self-care is for me.
Okay. And we were kind of like talking about the idea of personalizing self-care, so we're going to go into deepening in a second, but we also were talking about how it's personal to different people. So some people, like for me, I know exercise is important, for example, and I know that it does help keep me at a baseline, but sometimes when I hear people describe the feelings that they have after they exercise, I can't relate to that. I don't really know what that feels like. Maybe, and a lot of the time I would kind of think maybe I'm doing it incorrectly, or maybe I'm doing it in a way that I'm not getting this kind of almost rush of endorphins that people describe. But I kind of over time start to realize that like while exercise does help me keep a stable sense of control a little bit over my mood, especially during like the winter months, I'm just not getting that same like feeling of like rush that people describe sometimes. And so I do prioritize exercise, but I don't kind of like make that the biggest piece of my self-care routine all the time.
Oh, same.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel the same way. And so we were talking about that more to describe the sense of that the way self-care can be described might not apply to you, and that's okay, and that self-care needs to be personalized to what works for you. And yeah, depending on what your life situation is, like being single versus being in a relationship. I find that when I'm in a relationship, I have to try harder to do self-care for myself because I tend to take on the needs of my partner as a way maybe to avoid taking care of myself, or I just don't think of it in the moment. Whereas when I'm single, it's a little bit easier. Or if I'm in a good mood, if it's in the summertime, it's easier to take part in self-care than in the winter. So just kind of noticing that. Another way that I've been learning about self-care that can be difficult is unpacking trauma, which I don't think is something that we talk about or think about a lot as a self-care practice, but I found that unpacking my trauma and doing healing work that is seen as difficult and like kind of a lot of almost work that creates growing pains, long-term helps with my self-care. And that's just partly because I think it helps develop my relationship with myself. When I unpack my traumas, when I do difficult healing work, I know myself better, and I also know partly what I need, but also situations where it's like, if I didn't really take the time to notice my trauma and what triggers moments of like remembering trauma, I wouldn't know to not put myself in those situations. I also wouldn't really be healing from trauma that creates behaviors that are not healthy for me. If I never confront that trauma, I was finding that I couldn't engage in deeper self-care with myself because I didn't know myself very well. I didn't know why I was doing harmful behaviors or why I would just feel bad sometimes for no reason. I was kind of avoiding myself because it was a difficult process. And when I started engaging in that difficult process, I found my self-care overall did start feeling more effective for me. Give me one sec. Just have to adjust the slides again.
I guess following on from what you were talking about with trauma, trauma is different for everyone. What's traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you. Trauma is any event or experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. It can affect us or you. It can affect you physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, and or all of those things. And there's three main types of trauma. There's acute. Acute is more of a single incident. Then there's chronic. And chronic is more, for an example, it happens over a period of time. So, for example, it would be...
the slides are on my phone, too. Yeah.
It would be child abuse, as an example. Complex trauma would be a mixture of multiple traumas. So it could be acute and chronic. So, yeah, with the idea of trauma, I think that trauma and self-care go hand in hand because, for me, my self-care became very important to me because I had experienced trauma. I feel like if I hadn't experienced trauma of any kind, then I would be like, okay, let me just not do this. You know, it just became my life's work to be a better person, to not have my experiences define who I am as a person. I wanted to be in control of that. It allowed me to tap into my own self and my own self-awareness. So, yeah, I think
that makes a lot of sense. I feel like the idea of not necessarily like kind of like being like happy about having trauma, but kind of seeing the ways in which it impacted your life to create more self-awareness.
Absolutely.
And I think also the idea of it almost seems like you can sometimes like trauma can feel so overwhelming, like I can't deal with it. But I think kind of making it a part of your life instead of defining you and making it something that is so big and overwhelming that I can't deal with it also helps with the process of maybe unpacking a little bit.
It allowed, taking a step back sometimes, it allowed me to see the bigger picture. I think that in a lot of self-care practices or a lot of self-care journeys that are on social media, it's, there's a lot of focus on survivorhood. We're all survivors. We've survived something, da, da, da. But for me to be a survivor, I had to be a victim first. And I have to acknowledge that those were very valid spaces for me. And sometimes I still feel like a victim, even if I've worked through it for, 10 plus years. So it's just understanding journeys, and going with the flow in the way that life happens and not necessarily the journey that I force upon myself.
Right. And creating space for whatever happens.
It's like, the concept of, let go and let life happen. I'm still learning that for sure.
Process.
Definitely trying.
Up and down.
It's definitely up and down. But it's important for me in my self-care to know that not everything is going to go the way I want it to go. I guess my need to control things comes up. That's why I try and take a step back so I can see the bigger picture, for sure.
So now, we were going to talk a little bit about triggers and how they connect to trauma, how they form out of trauma, and just kind of even what they are. So I don't know if you, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Triggers are moments that bring you back to the original event that happened, the original traumatic experience. They can involve all of your senses, or just a few, or just one. For me, one of my triggers for a long time, I worked through that one for the most part, was music. There were certain songs that would send me back to very traumatic experiences. Where I was like, as soon as I heard that, I felt like I was right there. I felt powerless. I felt helpless. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. I would panic. I would freeze. But what I think I would have mentioned before is that what's traumatic to me may not be traumatic to someone else. So different things trigger different people, for sure. And some triggers are come to the surface very quickly, and some take a period of time. You may not realize straight away. They might be harder to recognize, for sure. So it's just a journey of finding out about ourselves after trauma. Yeah, because then you start to create a new normal, a new understanding of yourself. Like, okay, how am I after this experience? Do I, wear certain clothes? Do I, eat certain things now? Am I restricted? Why did this change me? You start to really think. It kind of forces you to think critically about life,
right,
and how you interact with other people, for sure, in my experience.
That makes sense. And kind of like recognizing that some things just are going to, I guess, like be triggers for you, and not so much kind of then being like, okay, there's nothing I can do about it, but at least recognizing what they are. And I think what you were saying about how triggers are personal, because for me, I think I've definitely heard the music, like for a lot of people, like a really common thing that sometimes I'll hear is like, I can't listen to that song because that song reminds me of like an ex. Like I think that comes up a lot.
For sure.
But for me, I think music has never really done that, but for me, certain television shows, especially like sometimes kids shows that remind me of a time when I was a kid that I didn't really like, I can't really watch anymore, or I don't like to watch, or I'm at least working through a process of being like, well, why does it make me feel this way? And I think a part of it is kind of realizing that there is a power, sorry, give me one sec. There is a power, I guess, that like triggers can have, in that I still haven't found a way to deal with the fact that it's like, oh, maybe I want to, have nostalgic, like, I don't know, cartoon marathons or whatever, but I can't watch the show because it reminds me of a difficult time, and kind of recognizing that is what it is, but knowing that the process of kind of like recognizing that it's a trigger, and kind of knowing like, okay, maybe on certain days where I'm in a low mood, don't watch those shows, or kind of avoid certain triggers if that's what you need in that moment, is really powerful and does give you control, because it gives you control over what is going to put me in this space that I am like uncontrollably in and feel uncontrollably bad. And even if maybe one day I'd like to work towards being able to sit with the things that triggered me at one point, knowing them, I think, is the first step. And for me, I think that brings me into my piece, which is kind of like, what does unpacking trauma look like? And we were just talking about like triggers. One big thing that I think about when I think of like the healing work of unpacking trauma, which can kind of feel like a vague thing to say, you don't really know what it means, but it's basically kind of just like doing things in your control to acknowledge or keep track of the things that bring up your trauma, that traumatize you, and the harmful behaviors that might come from that you don't realize you're doing because of a traumatic incident. So one, I have four different ways that four things that unpacking trauma can look like, basically, and one of them is tracking and noticing your triggers. So not always dwelling on them, not necessarily like trying to, I guess, learn to deal with them all the time, because that's not always possible, but at least just noticing, writing down moments where it's like, in this moment I felt uncontrollably bad for no reason, and I don't really know why, but writing down maybe things that were happening, even small things like what scents were in the air, what music was playing, was there a TV show playing, was a certain person there, and over time writing down moments where you kind of felt triggered and what was happening in that situation can help you kind of start to pinpoint what are my triggers, and maybe even learning why are they my triggers. It can sometimes help with that overall sense of being like, why do I feel this way, or what did my trauma look like, or how has it manifested in my life now? So tracking and writing down, maybe even if it's not exact triggers, but tracking and writing down like just different things that could be triggers in moments where you felt triggered. Another way that unpacking trauma can kind of be like a practice would be noticing and checking harmful behavior that might come from trauma. So for some people, for me, for example, I was kind of noticing that in some situations, some social situations, I would drink more or it's like smoke more weed than I would normally do, and I wasn't really sure why. And not that those things are inherently harmful, but I was noticing that, oh, when I hang out in these groups or with this person or in these situations, I'm just noticing that I'm just taking in substances more than I normally would. And And that was helpful for me to note. It helped me note like why I was doing it, but it also helped me note that a harmful behavior that I sometimes do to cope is like I will like take in substances more than I want to, where it feels out of my control. And so for me, that was helpful to notice because it kind of helped me realize what are causing the behaviors and what are the behaviors that I want to shift. So that's a second thing. And the last thing that I'll talk about is something that isn't always available to every person and can sometimes be difficult to get, but it's therapy, which is something that can be a little bit inaccessible for a lot of people. I have a therapist through my school. A lot of schools, or even sometimes your workplace might offer benefits, but that's not always available to you. And when I wasn't in therapy or when I didn't have access to therapy, I would find free resources that were kind of therapy-esque. So one resource that I have at the end of my slides is a podcast called Therapy for Black Girls.
Oh, yeah,
that's a really good podcast.
Oh, it's so good. Oh my God.
We love to see it. Oh, I love her so much.
It's so good. Like, I don't know. Someone mentioned it to me a while ago, and I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, you know. And then maybe a couple of weeks ago, I started listening to it. And I just listened to it like the whole day, and I was like, my life has changed forever. Wow, like
in a few hours, I'm different.
Yeah, like great. What is this? Now I'm researching different things. I was like, okay, wow. Like it's actually really fantastic. I definitely recommend it. It's really, really good.
It's a really good podcast, and I think it's helpful because it's like maybe it's not the same as having a therapist in the room talking specifically to you. But you kind of start to realize that a lot of the things that you're going through, many people, especially people in like in the group that deals with the same things that you do. So like Black women and femmes deal with a specific kind of oppression that also impacts mental health. And so having a podcast that specifically speaks to that, even if they're not speaking to you specifically, really helped me when I couldn't necessarily access a therapist. Another podcast that I recommend is Queer Walk. So it's queer WOC, Queer Women of Color. They're a podcast that focuses on queer women of color. And one of the hosts is also a therapist. She does a similar thing to Therapy for Black Girls, where she speaks to certain she kind of like talks about different ways to unpack trauma in a healthy way, like we're talking about, and also talks about different things that just different like helpful practices for mental health that I felt was really helpful. So if you can't necessarily access a therapist, that makes sense, but there are maybe free resources that you could use that would also just have somebody who has maybe some like knowledge and like care and empathy that can help guide you through the healing process.
Yeah, like on Instagram, there's a few folks on Instagram that I really enjoy. Brown Girls Who Bruja.
Send me that. Send me that link. Yeah.
It's just like it's so good, and like she just talks about things. I'm just like, yeah, I get it. Oh, you get it? Okay, I get it. We're just here in community, and then when she goes live, it's just like her energy is just glowing. Even if she's talking about something that's like very heavy, it's like she's worked through it, and working through it constantly. And it's this business that she's created with her daughter, and it's just like, wow, this is such an interesting concept to me. So yeah, I definitely recommend that one. And I don't know, just filtering through social media things. Like I can't follow certain people, noticing what triggers me as well. What you were talking about, noticing stuff and noticing that some of my triggers come up when I'm having conflict with people. I'm like, why am I mad here? Like, why am I actually mad? Is it really the fact that they said something that was like not that bad, or is it something beyond what they did? Maybe it was something that happened in my childhood, something that happened like 5 weeks ago that like I didn't really address. So yeah, it's just noticing, being aware. Self-care is sometimes noticing and sometimes saying, you know what, I need to take a break from noticing. I just need to watch some Netflix. Not sponsored by Netflix.
I think you're lying, but okay. Whatever you say. But that actually brings me to my next piece. That was really helpful of a segue, because my microphone keeps falling. It's just really annoying. There we go. My next piece was Aftercare, because you just mentioned noticing how like self-care is a lot of noticing, but also how it can sometimes be taking a step back and being like, maybe now isn't the time to do it. Maybe it's not the time to even act, but maybe it's a time to just, maybe you're in a space where it's like, I can just notice my triggers, I can just notice my harmful behavior, but I'm not really in a place right now to do anything about it. I'm just taking note, I'm writing it down. Sometimes it's so it can be just kind of like, I can't even engage with this right now. I'm not in a space to do any of that work. That's also okay. But part of, I guess, like the unpacking process, unpacking trauma and noticing triggers and noticing your relationship with yourself is knowing when I can't do this right now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about aftercare, which is a word that like, I feel like I usually connect it to like the idea of tattoos. Like when you get a tattoo or a piercing, they give you like a little brochure or something of like aftercare, how to take care of this painful thing that's happened, so that like the healing process goes as smoothly as possible. Some people in session were mentioning that in kink spaces, in BDSM
Yeah,
spaces,
that's where my mind went.
Yeah.
I was like, super kinky.
That's not immediately where it
Like,
was.
that's where it was. It was like kinky and then aftercare. Ooh, shaving. So those are the two things there.
The two main ones.
That was it. But now you're mentioning tattoos. Yes, definitely.
Also that, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
And aftercare for like healing work is kind of similar. It's basically like when a painful or just like a very intense thing happens, what are the steps that I'm going to take afterward to try to make my healing process feel like be safe but also be effective for me. So when engaging in this work, which is obviously very intense and in itself is triggering, working through trauma and noticing your triggers in itself is going to bring that stuff up for you again. I think it's important to take care of yourself after and even before, and also just notice when you're not in the right headspace to engage in that kind of work in that moment. So I have 4 different tips for aftercare. So one is set aside time for self-soothing after. So for me, that kind of looks like if I'm gonna maybe engage in some kind of unpacking trauma exercise like journaling or writing down some things that happen, like just kind of journaling about something that happened before and trying to notice, well, like, why did I feel this way? What was going on? I try to make sure it's not a day where I have to have a shift at work right afterward, or when I have to go to class right afterward, just because usually after I engage in that kind of work, even though I do feel lighter, I feel like I've let something go, I also don't always feel good. I sometimes feel really just like depressed, kind of just in a low mood.
Totally.
And it can be really difficult to then have to go back out into the world and like put on a work face or like a friend face, even going out, socializing. It can be hard to like just be like, okay, I'm back, and just snap back into that.
For sure. I totally felt that way when I had a bad therapist, because not all therapists are good. Like, I could say that hands down.
That's a tip
not
that
all therapists are good. And a good therapist will tell you not all therapists are good, and not all are good for you, you know? And I remember leaving session after session with one in particular and just feeling so drained and tired, and then like having to get on the subway and like just so many people around and their energy. I was just like, I can't deal with this. So yeah, like aftercare is really important, and knowing that like things change. Sometimes it's okay, like, you know what, I don't want to get on the subway at this stop. I want to walk for a little bit if I can. If my body allows me to do that, I'm going to do that. If it means I'm going to try and get a snack before and miss rush hour because I just don't want to do with this, that works
That
too.
is what it is.
Yeah, like, you know, and being open to change, which sounds scary now I say it out loud. But yeah, being open to change. Things change along the day, from hour to hour, from moment to moment, and being aware of that for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is a good point too around kind of, I guess noticing kind of like if you have a bad therapist, noticing maybe why do I feel tired all the time? Because definitely some therapy sessions I feel tired and drained, but if it's every time and I never really feel like I'm taken to a place of safety at any point, then it's kind of like, is this the right therapist for me?
Yeah.
And I think noting that too is a sense of aftercare, is noting like some kinds of work you might always feel drained and tired afterward, and that just might mean, similar to like knowing what your triggers are, knowing that maybe that kind of work isn't for you. Personalized self-care, kind of a sense of a lot of the stuff we're talking about is just general tips, but if you're finding that like journaling, I really can't, like that's not helpful for me, you don't have to force yourself to do it. If you have a therapist that is not good for you, it doesn't mean force yourself, just keep going, because eventually it'll just be helpful. It's
Because therapy is amazing. Like, it's just
not always.
It's hard work. It's hard work. Therapy can really be hard work. And if it's not affordable, then it's like expensive. Yeah, even when you go to like walk-in clinics, there's the Griffin Center has a walk-in clinic. I think if you're under 30.
Okay.
I think. Don't at me.
Google it.
But I know there's certain locations around the city. I think there's 6 locations that do free walk-in therapy-based conversations with folks for free, which is pretty good.
I think so. Yeah. And a lot of like CHCs in Toronto, community health centers, their waiting lists can be pretty long, but you can put yourself on a waiting list for a therapist if you are low income and under the age of 30, I believe, maybe 29. One of the two, but that's another resource in the city. So we looked at setting aside time. So this is similar to, this tip is similar to the one that I gave earlier around tracking your triggers, but also tracking how you feel after a journaling session. So it kind of might feel like, or whatever work that you're doing, that's a journaling session, whether that's noting your behaviors in your mind or writing it down, whether that's like after therapy, whether that's kind of like just kind of noticing, how do I feel? Not always having to write it down. I find writing it down is helpful because even if I think of something, I'll often forget. Like if I think like, oh, after that therapy session I felt tired, I might not remember that and track it. And I also think writing it down helps you kind of see like, okay, maybe like when we talked about this stuff in therapy, I felt worse than this stuff. It just kind of helps, for me at least, kind of keep track of like how I feel after engaging in this work. And my last tip is noticing when you're not ready to do certain kinds of exercises, which we actually just talked about a little bit, or noticing if certain exercise isn't for you, and looking into other ways maybe that unpacking trauma can be personalized to yourself, to your needs, what kind of trauma that you experience and what kind of triggers that you have. So that's my last tip. And that brings us to the wrap up, kind of the end of what we took away from this workshop. You're so excited. Did you want to start us off? Like, what did you take away from this?
What did I take away from it? Self-care is personal. Self-care changes. I personally need to be more gentle with myself, and that is okay. It's okay taking risks, in the sense that, let me try something different. Like, let me try a different self-care practice. Like, oh, I haven't tried this before. This might actually work. It's okay to try and find community that, have similar ideas to me. Self-care doesn't, even though self-care is a very personal, this is a me thing, it's nice to know that other people are practicing self-care around you as well. So then you don't feel so alone. Sometimes you can do the back and forth of like, oh, you tried this? Oh, cool, I tried this. Just like the conversation we're having. Oh yeah, so you listen to podcasts. I only started listening to podcasts recently. Before, like totally like maybe a couple months, not at most. I was like, I was totally against it. I was like, who cares? Like, this is weird.
This is a passing fad.
It just made me feel so weird about it. I was like, when am I going to listen to a podcast? Like, and then now that's all I do. So things change. So yeah, just being open to change and knowing that things don't always go the way you want, but it kind of works out if you're open to it sometimes.
Thank you. I feel similarly. I think one thing that you said that I'm going to steal as my takeaway is going to be, I think even in this moment talking to you about like how self-care went for you, like specifically like when you said that like exercise doesn't really work for you, and just like your up and down journey kind of made me also feel less alone. And I think talking about it in real life as opposed to taking cues from like the way it's marketed sometimes and assuming that everyone is doing that, and if it's not working for you, then you're doing something wrong. And even though it's something where it's like people do talk about it, but I think in the way where you're really talking about the ups and downs of how I tried this self-care practice, it didn't work, so I had to backtrack and start over again, or I tried this, it worked for a while, but then I realized it was making me feel bad. All of the kind of complexity and the muddiness of how self-care can look gets lost and I don't feel like that's something that we're encouraged to talk about. We're kind of encouraged to talk about the end result of self-care or the nice parts of self-care. So that's one takeaway, is how deepening self-care can look messy, and it can look complicated, and it can be difficult, and talking about that with other people can be a really helpful way in combating kind of comparing yourself or assuming that you're doing it wrong. And another piece that I took away from this workshop is, I guess, how much practical work goes into self-care and healing work. So I guess when I thought about self-care before, and even like maybe like last year, for example, I would think about the stuff we talked about before, like kind of taking a nap, drinking water. But even that stuff is hard work. And then the idea of journaling, writing down, tracking your triggers, noticing them, all that stuff is like time out of your day. It takes time, and it's a specific activity that you have to do, and it's not always seen that way. And sometimes for me, I would kind of feel like, why do I have to do all this work? But I feel frustrated, like why do I have to do all this work? Is it going to lead anywhere? Sometimes it kind of feels like I don't have time. Like, would actively always be like, I don't have time for this. But now taking the time to put effort into that healing work, into self-care work, into my relationship with myself, I see how valuable it is, even though in the moment, especially in the beginning of my journey, it kind of felt frustrating, because it felt like, why do I have to do all of this, and is this even going to help? So that's my main takeaway. Yeah.
I agree.
Well, thanks for everyone for coming to this live. It's kind of weird because I can't see anyone, and I really need glasses because I can't read any of the chat that's been happening. But to everyone that showed up, thank you so much. And stay tuned for, I believe, in like a half an hour, Kiyosha is doing a part 2 on redefining self-care. And then later tonight at 6 and 7, our other like session members who are really awesome and like done a lot of like really great facilitation work are doing a workshop on seasonal depression and ways to combat that, which is important, especially now that it is dark and gray outside.
Yes.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.